Pacific Research Institute's Next Round podcast. I'm Rowena Ichon, COO, and with me, as always, is Tim Anaya, Vice President of Marketing and Communications. How are you, Tim?
I'm great. How are you?
Fine, thank you. Well, we wanted to open the podcast just saying a few words about the passing of Senator Dianne Feinstein. Tim, for as long as I can remember, she was part of the political scene here in the state. I still remember when she took over as mayor of San Francisco after the tragic assassination of Mayor Moscone and Supervisor Harvey Milk. I remember that as a kid. You know, we didn't agree with her on probably most issues, although at one time in her career, she was sympathetic to more options in education. I don't think she went all the way for school choice, but I think she was kind of leaning towards, especially in DC, having more options for kids. She was part of the old guard of politics, the environment where when I started my career, where you had friends on the other side of the aisle, fought a good battle at the end of the day, but you don't have the kind of animosity in politics that you see today.
Well, if you talk about as a transformational mayor of San Francisco, we've seen two in our lifetime. One is Willie Brown and the other is Dianne Feinstein. The things that they did as mayor and the stamp they put on the city. I mean, saving the cable car alone, that was her initiative. I think I remember her as she was a statesperson. She was always a lady in the good sense of the term. She, I think, was very lucky that she was, though Californians were not lucky on this point, that she served in the Senate for most of her time alongside Barbara Boxer, who was as radical and disruptive a partisan as could be. And in contrast, her kind of quiet plotting, building up consensus, getting the job done on a host of issues, including things like water, where she wasn't afraid to cross party lines. I think she'll be always remembered for her statesmanship and her willingness to work with anybody to get the job done.
That's right. Well, let's move on to her replacement. So, Tim, I'm not familiar with her. What are you hearing in Sacramento?
This has been a great saga since this informal chatter began with Senator Feinstein's ill health of the last year. And he promised that he would appoint only a Black woman to the Senate. Now, we can quibble with him about, you're excluding so many thousands of people who would have been effective United States senators with that kind of racial identity politics. But nonetheless, that's what he said. And he got into more trouble in recent weeks because he insisted the candidate be a caretaker, meaning that they would only fill out the rest of Feinstein's term, because we have a Senate election next year and there are three big candidates who are running.
I actually thought that was quite a fair thing for him to do.
Oh, I agree. You don't want to be seen as putting your thumb on the scale. And especially if one of the candidates, Barbara Lee, obviously isn't his candidate for the Senate. Well, you certainly don't want to give her a leg up or give one of the other contenders a leg up, because you're going to have all these partisan charges going back and forth. So over the weekend, the governor's office let it be known that the new replacement senator does not have to be only a caretaker, that they would be okay if the senator ran. And sure enough, the governor appointed LaFonza Butler, who is a former staff member of his and political consultant of his. She is currently the president of Emily's List, which is the national Democratic fundraising groups promoting abortion rights candidates, pro-abortion rights candidates. She also was president of the SEIU in California, and she also was a UC regent and worked for Airbnb for a time. And so it's pretty clear when you have all of that is your background. And she also not only is a Black woman, but she also is California's first openly gay senator. And so when you have all of that in your background, you're not someone at 44 years old who's going to come to the U.S. Senate just for a year and a half. So to me, it's pretty clear she's going to run, and I think will be a very formidable candidate for the Senate. It's interesting in a couple of ways for Newsom. A, it ticks a box with Black women voters in South Carolina who might be deciding the presidential candidacy of Gavin Newsom someday. B, it shuts down all the complaints about we don't want to have a Black woman can only be a caretaker senator. So it really is a thumb in the eye to Barbara Lee and the people who were pushing her. But C, if you're a Adam Schiff or a Katie Porter, you're going to come under immense pressure by the powers that be behind the scenes, and especially SEIU and Emily's List and all these people that have a ton of money and have a ton of institutional and manpower support, you're going to really think twice about continuing your campaign for the Senate. Now, as Schiff has, as he announced today, $32 million in the bank. He's not going to go quietly in the night. But, they're going to have to really think hard about, do they want to continue a race that's going to be very tough for them to win now? Or do they turn around and announce they're going to go back to running for the House? That will be very interesting to see.
I read the statistic the other day that of the Black vote, 75% are women. So I didn't realize how important women were, Black women were, to that segment of the Democrat constituency. It's mostly all women. So no wonder the Democratic Party and the establishment are always looking to find Black women to promote and to highlight.
And that's right. And for so many things, for Newsom, LaFonza Butler ticks a lot of boxes. So, it really is not and this is someone who has worked for him, who has been a close ally, and you can expect to be a close ally in the Senate. Now, what kind of senator will she be? I would expect she's going to be very far left activist. I'm sure, given her union background, is going to be all for pushing Congress to overturn laws like California's AB 5 on worker empowerment and denying people's opportunities for entrepreneurship. I'm sure she'll be very far left on things like judges, things like, certainly abortion funding, those sorts of things. I would expect that she's going to be very far activist left in her voting record and her priorities in Washington.
Tim, let's move on to the GOP debate now that things have settled a little bit. I have to say, I hate to admit this, but I was pretty tired that day and I fell asleep in the last third of the debate, but I think I got the gist of it. The problem is there are just too many people on stage and it really should have been whittled down further. There's lots of sniping, I recall, and I'm okay with that as long as it doesn't last a long time because the audience really can't hear anything above the shouting. I think overall, DeSantis and Nikki Haley turned in strong performances. But when you look at these debates, most of the candidates, I would say most of them agree pretty much 80% of the time. There are some differences in foreign policy with respect to Ukraine these days. You and I have been around the block. Most of these candidates, what I worry about is they talk a good game when they're running, but what I look for is the candidate that's going to have the fortitude and the skill to actually implement conservative and free market policies. And that's harder to find. And you can't really see it here in these debates. And sometimes the record helps, but not always. So the point might be moot because Donald Trump is far and away ahead of all of them.
Well, I agree with you on Haley and DeSantis. They had, if you consider that the best of the debate, they did. And certainly DeSantis had a much better performance in the second debate than the first debate. But I think really Donald Trump emerged as the winner of the debate because all you saw was people shouting at one another and talking over one another and so desperate to get, a few seconds of spotlight that I don't know how you could take away much of anything anybody said from that debate. It was really just them acting like children up on the stage. I caught about a half hour of it. I was in Texas for our school board training event. So I'm glad I had a glass of wine or two before hitting my hotel room and catching up on the debate, because you definitely needed that as a viewer. So the question now is, gosh, is anybody really well served by these debates? And what are we going to have in the third debate that's coming sometime in November? They say that they're going to winnow the number of contestants on the stage further. But really, unless you're getting a good, I think that's a good thing, that you're really going to winnow it down to probably the four key contenders, plus Trump, whether he shows up or not. But I don't know that fewer is going to make it better, but I don't know that anybody was well served by that debate last week.
Yeah, and I'm thankful that there are no debates in October, so we get a break, Tim.
Yes, indeed.
So finally, let's talk about your old boss, Kevin McCarthy. So he managed to avert a shutdown. And in the last podcast, I said the shutdown was a lot of drama and that it would never happen. But I have to say, Saturday morning, I thought I was going to have to eat crow because I really thought that he wasn't going to be able to pull it off. But he did. So good for him. And what are your thoughts?
Well, they continue to underestimate him, and he showed once again, he can pull a rabbit out of a hat, and he pulled a pretty big one out on Saturday. But now the question is this this Matt Gaetz, who is obviously fueled by personal animus toward McCarthy. It's alleged he's going to file a motion to vacate the speakership sometime this week. So by the time you listen to this, you may know the outcome of that debate. I don't know. Now, keep in mind, the entire House votes for this, not just the Republican conference. So Democrats will get to weigh in on this too. Now, Democrats, of course, like Republican chaos. They think it advances their cause, as, we would be more grown-ups if we controlled the House. We would be more responsible leaders, have more stronger governance. But I don't know that it's in their interest to topple McCarthy as speaker, because you instantly plunge the House into chaos. It's unclear when you would ever get another speaker elected. We had 15 rounds the first time. And, there are some key things, Ukraine funding. And remember, we still have to pass all the spending bills, or else we're going to shut down the government in another 40 odd days. So I don't know that it's in their interest to overthrow Kevin. I certainly wouldn't bet against him here. I don't think it would be more than a handful of Republicans who would vote against McCarthy, probably that group of 6 or 8 or 10 who were voting against him on a lot of the budget and procedural bills the last week or two. But when your whole issue is personal animus, well, are you really going to unite 218 people to throw out that person to satisfy your personal grudge? I'd be very surprised if that happens. But get ready for more drama this week.
Yeah, it was clear from all of the interviews. It's too bad that it's got so personal. This is politics at its worst, but good for Kevin McCarthy that he pulled it off. Hopefully before 45 days, 44 days, or however many now, we'll have a budget and we'll be able to curtail some spending, because we're heading in a really grim path here if we don't try to at least hold the line or cut spending. Here's a few announcements. On Saturday, October 14th, we will be having our Northern California Gala with keynote speaker, renowned historian and political scientist Neil Ferguson. All the details on our website, and we hope you can all join us.
And for those of you who are interested in learning more about what's going to be a hotly debated issue here in California in the coming months, which is the debate over reparations, we're co-hosting a webinar on October 11th at noon Pacific time with Pacific Legal Foundation and the group Defend American Ideals. And it should be a very interesting discussion of the issue. One of the people there, the keynote speaker, will be Robert Woodson. And I think he will be, I'm very curious to see what he will have to say about the whole issue and the whole debate. He's a quite good and very well-known speaker and thinker. He's president of the Woodson Center, thinking about all these kind of issues related to African-American empowerment and lifting people out of poverty, etc. There's a very good panel of legal experts and others who are going to be discussing the issue. To register for the event, you can go to the Pacific Legal Foundation website, which is pacificlegal.org, and go on their events page, and you'll see it right there. So hope you'll join us for that very interesting event.
Thanks for that, Tim. So our guest this week is Dr. Wayne Winegarden, PRI Senior Fellow in Business and Economics. So Wayne and fellow Mackenzie Richards produced, I think, some very important research comparing the results of states that had highly restrictive policies during the pandemic and states that didn't. Intuitively we know this, but now we have the scholarship to back it. So their conclusion was that while these restrictive policies saved some lives, it really took its toll on other parts of our society, namely the economy, education, not to mention mental health and other health issues.
Well, and it really gives policymakers food for thought when, God forbid, we have another pandemic sometime, in the future. We can't do the same thing we did this time. They really need to take the lessons from COVID that Wayne and Mackenzie outline in our study and think about that when setting up future pandemic responses. So it'll get you thinking, it'll confirm some of the things you thought, it'll get you thinking, but more importantly, it will hopefully get policymakers thinking about what do we do for a future pandemic.
Thanks everyone for listening, and here's Wayne Winegarden. Welcome back to PRI's Next Round podcast, Wayne.
Oh, it's always great to be here.
So we're glad to have you back to discuss an issue that you're going to finally put to bed for all of us once and for all. Did these draconian COVID restrictions do any good? You've got a new brief out, co-authored with Mackenzie Richards, doing some serious deep dive into the data to see if restrictions by state and local governments actually save lives and prevent the spread. So what are your thoughts when you and Mackenzie started working on the brief?
Well, our goal was really to take an economist view on this public health question. And that's why when we titled it, we took a very famous Thomas Sowell quote, right? There's no solutions, only trade-off. And that was, I think, the real thing we wanted to convey, because it seems particularly kind of when you're talking about the public health aspect of the policies, we're not discussing kind of all of the consequences enough that we need to look at, okay, what are the benefits, what are the costs, and how do things net out? And that's what we, really wanted to explore. Because, logically speaking, if we keep people in their homes, right, there's going to be very large cost to it, right? And, we need to consider those, right? And that includes cost of freedom. But then, and we also need to look at when everyone eventually leaves their homes, what's going to happen? Are we actually stopping the virus, or are we delaying the virus? But then there's also the impacts of, if you have everyone home, it's harder for an infectious disease to spread. So there are the benefits of it. And so, these are the kind of questions and trade-offs that needed to be asked, before mandates were implemented, before lockdowns were implemented. And so kind of as a kind of looking at this afterwards, kind of our kind of review of it, these are the questions we wanted to ask.
So no solutions, only trade-offs, which our listeners can download at medicon.org if they're interested in reading it. It's really a data dive looking at states that were rated as having more restrictive interventions to study whether there were realized health benefits from these government restrictions. So set up your approach to the brief. What were some of the data sets you reviewed, and why was it important that you reviewed those particular sets of data? And did you have any trouble obtaining or analyzing the data given that COVID has happened so recently?
Well, starting with the data issues, and these are incredibly hard to get. And even when you get the data, it's really difficult to separate out all the different potential drivers of the data, what's driving the trends, because so many things are happening at once. And then the measurement, it's a measurement question. Are we accurately measuring the number of infections, the number of hospitalizations, mortality, all of these things? How do you measure or compare state policies when many of these aren't quantitative, they're qualitative? So there's all sorts of problems, and a lot of the different people looking into this issue, those are the things that we struggle with. What we were able to do is find what we thought was an objective evaluation of the stringencies of each state's policies. So how stringent were the mask mandates? How stringent were business closures, stay-at-home orders? On and on. And when we looked at it, and you alluded to this, Tim, based on the data, it was really clear when you're looking at the data and how the numbers fall apart that the states pretty cleanly fell into two categories: one that we called a high intervention state, and one that we called a low intervention state. So the high intervention states, they pretty universally imposed stricter and more comprehensive stay-at-home orders, business closures, mask mandates, school closings. Those were all much more stringent and much more broad-based compared to the states that fell into the low intervention category. We had a really good objective measure of the stringencies. And so then what we did is we wanted to compare those to basic data on employment, economic growth, education outcomes, hospitalizations from COVID-19, and mortality from COVID-19.
So when you start your paper with a review of some of the important research by others on the impact of COVID-19 lockdowns, what were some of the key lessons you learned by reviewing the work of your peers that influenced your outlook in devising PRI's study?
Well, I think if we go to the last data point I just talked about, COVID-19 mortality and hospitalization rates, which, those are key benchmark. And when you're talking about people who are looking towards, lockdowns and restrictions, that's the data point that we point to. How can we restrict mortality and hospitalization from COVID-19? And undoubtedly, that's incredibly important. But it's also, in this whole trade-off theme, it's also really important to recognize that there's undoubtedly a trade-off between, when you have a lockdown and its impact on the spread of COVID, but you also have a lockdown that's going to have an impact on other adverse health outcomes. When we have a delayed or a late cancer screening, that's going to lead to, when we have a later cancer diagnosis, you're going to be diagnosing it at later stages. And so there's going to be bigger health implications, higher mortality rates. There's mental health impacts, things of that nature. And a lot of the literature focuses on that. So that when you're talking about, well, what's the net public health benefit from these policies, it's incredibly important to look at it broadly speaking. Now, when we looked at our study, we actually intentionally looked at just the COVID-19 measured impact. And the reason we did that is we wanted to create what I would say is a best case scenario in terms of looking at what's the health impact with respect to COVID-19. So if the net health impact has to include the impact on mortality and other diseases, and there's other studies that did that, we wanted to focus on specifically if you impose these business closures, if you impose these stay-at-home orders, are you actually having an impact on COVID-19 mortality, or you have an impact on COVID-19 hospitalization, simply because that's the basic justification that's given for the policy. So that seemed like a natural question that needed to be answered before you start getting into the kind of the net impact. But it is very important to recognize that it is that net impact on mortality that matters the most.
So let's dive into this. We saw that these strict lockdown orders were justified in the first place about, trying to keep COVID-19 infection and mortality rates as low as possible. Well, what did you see in your look at the data? Was there any appreciable health benefits from these lockdown orders at all?
Again, if you just respect the COVID-19 infection and COVID-19 mortality rates, I think the data clearly show that, if you impose these strict mandates and you prevent people from seeing one another, that the number of infectious disease cases are going to go down, right? And I think another data point supporting this is we saw fewer cases of the flu during these winters when we had the strict lockdowns, right? And so fewer cases are going to need fewer hospitalizations and fewer deaths. Again, that's not the full health benefit from the policy, but important to understand that policy. We need to know whether that policy achieves that goal, and the data seems to indicate that it does. Again, there's another important caveat, which is, are we measuring those correctly? We explicitly, again, chose to ignore those concerns. One, that's a very different analysis. But again, we wanted to create that best case scenario for the policy's impact. So we just accepted the data as is. But that, of course, is another question is, are we measuring hospitalizations and mortality correctly? With those caveats, there seems to be a very clear connection between the stringency of those policies and the ability to reduce COVID-19 infection and COVID-19 mortality.
Wayne, you also compare the health data at different points in time during the pandemic in June 2020 and April 2021. So why did you select these dates as a benchmark, and why was it important to review COVID data from multiple points in time during the pandemic?
Well, this is a really important issue, particularly with evaluating the efficacy of the COVID-19 policies, because you have to remember when COVID-19 first hit the U.S., right, it didn't hit all the states at the same time, right? It hit New York, particularly New York City first, and then it spread through the country. Now, when the pandemic first hits New York, there's a bias because we were, there's just one state's data, but we weren't prepared as a country. Nobody was prepared. You can argue that we should have been different, but we were not. And we also had a worse understanding of this disease in and of itself. And so that bias makes it difficult to be able to cleanly say what's the impact of the policies, because those policies weren't being implemented. And again, that lack of preparation is and perhaps feckless actions at the beginning because things were poor. Our understanding was much less, and we wanted to kind of get all that biases out of the data. And so that's why we started with June 2020 as the beginning of our data set, because that was the first month where all 50 states had reported a COVID-19 fatality. So that's when we said, okay, this is when the pandemic is truly national phenomenon because it's in all 50 states. And so we believe that this helps account for that potential bias towards kind of, a higher infection rate in the states where the virus first appeared. Now, to test ourselves, we did actually look at, what if we didn't do our adjustment for those states that were first impacted? What if you start, when you're looking at the cumulative impact of hospitalization and the cumulative impact of mortality, and you start from when the first person that was impacted from COVID-19 as the start date? And if you do that, the relationship between the stringency of the lockdown, the ability to reduce hospitalization, ability to reduce mortality goes away. And so that is, I think, an interesting data point, an interesting thing to understand. In our view, we think that it shows that being impacted first has consequences, but that's certainly noteworthy. But we adjusted for it because we believe that's a first impact bias rather than an accurate way of measuring the policy's impact.
So perhaps the biggest takeaway from the study was that there were significant unintended consequences from stricter COVID-19 restrictions. So let's look at two areas, starting with the economy. Just how much did the economy suffer because of government-mandated shutdowns? What does the data show?
The data shows that there was significant impact to the economy. If you look through 2022, the end of 2022, the states that we categorized as the high intervention states, they experienced much steeper recessions. They had much slower recoveries compared to the low intervention states. So basically, the families in these high intervention states, they lost more opportunities, they lost more income, they struggled economically more, significantly more, compared to the low intervention states. In fact, looking at the job market, which is one number we particularly focus on in the paper, in the high intervention states, by the end of 2022, their employment, the amount of employment in those states was still 1.6% below kind of where employment was prior to the recession that all of these lockdowns created. Now, in the low intervention states, they had completely recovered, and employment in those states was 1.2% above. So the low intervention states had already completely recovered from in employment market sense from the recession, whereas at the end of 2022, the high intervention states were still in an employment recession. So put simply, the high intervention states paid an incredibly high economic price for imposing that type of strict mandate.
As PRI's Lance Azumi has documented, another significant unintended consequence, and one that parents and students are still suffering through today, is the impact on education. What does the data show about the negative impact of shutdowns on student learning, college prep, and future earning potential?
I think it's essential to carefully interpret this data because this is some of the largest costs that the stringent policies imposed on society, and more importantly, on individual children, adults, families, so on and so forth. And I think the first point that comes out when we look at it in terms of study is that universally, if you close down schools, or if you force kids to learn virtually, that it's going to harm students. Period. Any type of shutdown of schools is damaging, and there is no safe shutdown from that sense. And so, there's just very clear evidence that the education outcomes were severely harmed. Now, if we break it down by reading and math outcomes, then on the reading sense, what you saw is they were similar across the two categories. So that perhaps there's some sort of threshold impact. That's not something that we were able to explore, but any type of shutdown harmed reading outcomes, and they were similar across the two states. But what was interesting is that there was a significant difference on math scores. So that while reading was similar between the high intervention states and low intervention states, math scores in the high intervention states fell significantly more than the math scores in the low interventions, which, I think there is some logic to it, math being a very difficult subject where a lot of people, being in person would have a major impact on their ability to learn it. And then the cumulative nature of math being more difficult or more important, might explain it. But with respect to the stringency of the school and school closures, you see a much, much larger impact on math scores, which is where students were most vulnerable. And if you think about it, and Tim, you alluded to this when we're talking about future earnings, the importance of science and math to future earnings potential, that becomes a really important issue to understand, that on this crucial issue of math, we're actually really jeopardizing outcomes by having these more stringent shutdowns.
So finally, as we close, we don't want to be Monday morning quarterbacks, but I think we will for the purpose of our podcast. There are a lot of lessons that policymakers can learn from their COVID-19 response, especially on lockdown orders. So given the data that you reviewed in the study, what's your advice to policymakers when thinking about plans for future pandemic responses? What are some of the things that we could do differently to prevent harmful impacts on students, for example?
Well, first, I would say I think it's essential to be a Monday morning quarterback. And that's the whole point of this. So I'm very proud to be Monday morning quarterbacking on this one. And I think there are some really important lessons that we need to explore more and implement. I wish I could say if, but it very likely is when we are hit by another pandemic. The first is that whenever you have these policies, you can't ignore the unintended consequences. Those unintended consequences are both health, right? We only measured it based on COVID-19, kind of the way the public health had set it up, but it's that impact on net mortality that is most important. And we need to understand that there are unintended consequences, and we need to consider those so that delaying cancer screening is a real issue and is something that needs to be offset against the benefits in terms of preventing more COVID-19, in this case, the disease becoming much more widespread. Now, while we also didn't discuss this in the podcast, the literature review that we did in the beginning of the paper made very clear that the intended benefits from these policies are very clustered, right? That older people and people with compromised immune systems were the ones who were most at risk to the pandemic. And they're the ones who benefited the most from the stringent, what we call non-pharmaceutical interventions, but the lockdown, so much and so forth. And also importantly, especially for older people, they also bore the lowest costs from the unintended consequence, right? If you're retired, you're not so fussed when the jobs are shut down because you're retired. So you're not going to lose your income. You don't risk being laid off. So what you're then getting is that, if we simplify, older people are getting the highest benefits but paying the lowest cost, whereas younger people have a disproportionate share of the costs, right? They're bearing most of the costs, particularly students, but also workers, things of that nature, but then also are benefiting the least because they're actually the ones who are least likely to become seriously ill, hospitalized, and at a greatest risk of mortality. So I think you put all of this together. What's the lesson? One, extreme caution needs to be taken when you're talking about these stringent interventions in response to future threats. And we haven't even touched upon the civil liberties, freedom issues. This was very much an economic take. So we're not even touching that important issue. But that the existence of these trade-offs argues that we need to tailor policies, right? So that if we're understanding what works and what doesn't work, how can we tightly target those policies so you're only impacting those on the most vulnerable while you're also minimizing the cost on those who are going to be bearing most of the cost, students, working adults, things of that nature. And then you're talking about perhaps looking at lockdowns with respect to people in living in nursing homes, in nursing facilities, but not shutting down schools, so that you're keeping businesses open, keeping students going, but you're not, so you're protecting those who need to be protected without harming or imposing the cost on people who the protection is less because they're at less risk, but the unintended consequences harm them the most. And finding a better balance, because within this response, it seems clear that we really did a very poor job of balancing all of those types of considerations. And we need to do a better job next time.
Thanks so much, Wayne. And we encourage everyone to take a look at the study at pacificresearch.org. Thanks for joining us. If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Ichon. Hope you'll come back again for next round with PRI.